hour 3. So what we're going to do, we kind of done, there's a 3-part class, and we got to do the most complicated part now. Building the table was pretty easy. Building the form is pretty easy. Now we need to build this page. It's going to have to do several things, right? We're going to have to grab the inputs from our form, so we'll need to look at doing that. We need to connect to the database, and then we're going to need to write and execute some SQL to actually save that game record into the database. Okay? So we need to talk a little bit about connecting. So any dynamic web page is going to have a connection to the database. So I'm giving you a little exercise to do. You're going to get really familiar with the process of connecting to the database because you're going to do it every single week. Okay? So on Blackboard, in week 2, there's this little exercise. If you open it up, the connection exercise, it'll open up a Word document that will look like this. So here's what I want you to do with it. You'll notice the document is color-coded. Each color is a different section of the document. So this is all the code that you would need to connect to the database, with the exception of, you'll notice in the gray section, there's 3 parts that are X's, and it says password here. Obviously, to get this code to work, you'd have to put in, that's obviously where your credentials would go. So what I want you to do is you don't need long, just a few minutes. This is not a test. You can talk to the person next to you. What I want you to do, obviously, you can probably tell from the code, nothing's in the right order. Okay? So what I want you to do is drag these items around until you think you have the page in the correct sequence. Okay, so each color is a different element of the page. Yes, I know it looks horribly ugly. So I want you to move the items around until you think this page is in the right order. Then we can save it and we can try it out on the server together in a minute, because we're going to need some of this code to connect to our save page. So just open it in Word, edit the document, and drag these into the right order.
Are you recording for that?
I am. So the old library was called MySQLi. Okay? Now the benefits of using, the main reason we use PDO today instead of MySQLi is MySQLi only let us connect to a MySQL database. So if we wrote a PHP application and we wanted to use Oracle as the database, you couldn't use that library. The nice thing about PDO is it will connect to any type of database. So we don't have to, MySQL is the common choice for the PHP application, but we're not limited to MySQL. We may want to use something more powerful. Okay. So let's look at all of the pieces of information we have to supply when we connect to a database using PDO. The first thing we have to tell it is what type of database are we connecting to. So in this class, that will always say MySQL. We're not working with any other kind of database. That could say Oracle, DB2, SQL Server, something else. And then we've got to supply these 4 values. So what do those 4 values that I've highlighted represent? What other things do we need to tell the server if we want to connect to a database? Yep. So the database name is right here. So for you guys, that's just GC and your student number. What other things do we have to supply? The username and password. So obviously your username is the same as your password. And what about this? What's this value representing? Yeah, what server are we connecting to? So anytime we connect, we need to, in a PHP page, we want to have it talk to database, we've got to supply these 5 pieces of information, right? What type of database is it? What server is it? What database on the server do we want? And what are the username and password credentials so that we can get in? We have to supply all of those things. Okay. So I'm going to make you type this line a lot over the next few weeks, because this is an awesome interview question. If I was going to hire somebody on co-op to be a PHP developer, I'd say, show me what a PHP database connection string looks like, and see whether you know it or whether you don't. So you're going to type this enough times that you learn it. Then I'll show you the shortcut so you don't have to type it every time. Copying and pasting is a terrible idea because you're never going to learn it. The only way you're going to learn it is to do it.
So when you put in your password, will you replace the password here?
Yes. Yes. Okay. So we're going to try to connect here. This tries to get our PHP page to talk to the database when that line of code executes. So then what happens next? What should we do next? Which color? Yeah, so the red. So if we don't have a connection, and this syntax will look similar probably for you guys from Java, what an if statement looks like. We'll talk more about them later. So we have some condition, and what does this exclamation mark mean? It means the same in PHP as it would in Java. Yeah, it just means not. So if we don't have a connection, we want to stop our processes and put out this message. We can't connect. What would come after the red section? The green. So the red is what happens if our connection fails. The green is what happens if our connection is successful. What does this command do? Echo. What do you suppose that'll do? Yeah, it's a really, I don't know why in PHP they didn't use the word print or output. Their command for displaying stuff to the page is echo. So we'll use that a lot. So it's going to display this message on the page if we have a connection.
Don't answer if and not con, but the value con is not a boolean. It's just like
It just evaluates whether this has a value or not. It will tell us whether that connection is empty or whether it has a value.
You know, if I just like I didn't input the password, is that
We'll try it and see. Great question. We'll try it. So what comes next?
equal to 9?
Must be that light green one.
Yeah. So what's happening here? What do you think is happening in this line?
Closing the connection.
We're closing the connection. This is super important for web developers. Why do we have to close this connection? What happens if we don't close it? Will it stay open forever? Won't stay open forever, but what happens and why is closing it so important when we're done using the database?
Because you want to close that database, you don't want it to.
Okay, we don't want it to remain open, but there's a very important reason why we don't. How many can it? You want to take a guess?
Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. No, you guess.
I lost what I was saying. Okay.
The reason why is any database server is only going to allow so many connections in at once. It doesn't have the resources to allow 50 million connections simultaneously. So let's say we open our connection to save our video game. If we don't close it in our code right away, that connection will actually stay open, and every server has a default timeout. Usually that timeout is 15 or 20 minutes. So we may only need the connection for 1 second. So let's think about this. If we leave it to stay open to expire on its own, let's say our server allows 1,000 concurrent connections, okay? So the first 1,000 users hit a dynamic page which talks to the database. That's fine. All those people can create data, read data. What happens when user 1001 tries to hit save or clicks a link that pulls from our database? What do they see in the browser? Well, their page is trying to get into the database. It could be. I think somebody else said it.
Connection server is busy.
They don't see anything. They see a white screen, and up here they see this, right? The page is waiting to do something and can't finish because it's waiting to get into the database, which has been locked because the developer was too lazy to disconnect. So when we're working on these pages, we're the only ones using them, so you won't see any difference if you ignore this. It'll work fine. But best practices is make sure as soon as we're done with the database on every page, disconnect. Because if that application gets used by a lot of people, we might be locking people out and making them wait for no good reason.
Is there any reason just because about the security. If you don't close it, you can anybody have the authority to.
Well, that is another challenge. Yes, we don't want to leave those connections open for security any longer than we need to, for sure. So we'll connect, and then what comes next? Sorry, we'll disconnect. Yeah, we'll close the PHP tag, and then we got to do one more thing. Yeah, let's move the body above the end of the HTML. So there's our page. What I typically do, as soon as I type my connection line, I automatically go down and type the disconnection line before I write all the code in the middle. That way I don't forget to disconnect. Okay. So now what I'm going to do, I'm going to take all this code. Let's try it out. I'm going to copy it to my clipboard. It's in the right order. And then, Bison, we'll come back to your question about what happens if the password's wrong. I'm going to make a new file called connect.php. Okay. I'll take out this stuff and I'll just paste it in. So now I've got all my code. Now, I do need to put in my username and password. It's not going to connect like this, so I'm going to change my database name to GCR Freeman. You need to change yours to GC and your student number. You also need to change your username. And you need to put in your password. Now, Bison, you asked what happens if the password's wrong. That's not my password, but I'm going to try it this way so we can see what happens if we don't get a connection. So now I'm going to upload this file to the server, and I want to try loading it in the browser. I should get one of two messages. If my connection is good, my page should say connected to the database. If there's something wrong with my connection, it should say could not connect. So I'm just going to refresh my local directory here. Now here's my connect page. I'll copy it to the server. And now I want to try it out. So instead of loading game, now here's what I got. It never actually printed my message because it threw an error instead. And if we read the error, access denied. Now you'll also notice something, and later on we're going to need to deal with error handling. This is really not good to let your pages do this. What's the problem here? Besides the fact it just didn't work, there's a bigger problem. It's showing my connection string that failed, including, ta-da, my database password. So I've just published that online. Now, fortunately, this password doesn't work. But if we mess something else up with our credential, it's going to print it out. So later on, we'll look at how do we handle errors. So if something goes wrong, this doesn't happen. We'll look at that after reading week or just before reading week. So I just need to put... It's a big pain that I'm constantly, because I have to put my password in to get it to work. And I have to remember to try not to show it to you guys, and more importantly, not to show it to the rest of the world. If I took out that con equals null, we would notice no difference. It would still connect. It would just be that my connection would stay open for a while until the server decided to time me out. So make sure you upload your page to the server and try it out. So we're going to need on our save game page, we're going to need this line and we're going to need that line. Our connect and disconnect we're going to need.
I still can't connect files.
Do you have an Ethernet cable?
No.
Okay. If you have one at home, you may just need to code it for today and try. If you run your pages tonight, they'll work. It's just that it's just because we're so many connections from here. We'll also maybe talk about, if I can quickly, about running everything locally, which is easier. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I want to build my save game page now. Rather than rewrite all of this code because in the interest of time, and I'd like to get this page done today, what I'm going to do is copy everything here. So copy everything from your connect.php page. And then we're going to make a new file. And we have to call this one save game, right? It's got to match the action from our game form. So this is the page, the URL that our form is loading. So this file has to be called save-game. So I'm going to paste all that in. To make it simple, I'm going to take out my if. If my connection fails, I'll just let the page crash for now. So I'm actually going to take out all of this code. We don't need to print out to the page that we're connected to the database. That's unnecessary. So all we've got, and I'll change the title to Saving Your Game. Okay. And I'll put in a couple comments here as we go that explain everything we're doing. So here, we're connect to the database. And here, we're disconnecting. So I'll put comments in my PHP code always. So when we go back and look at these files later, you'll know what we're doing. So I'll save that. But we need to do a couple of other things. This page on its own, yeah, it'll connect to the database, but it doesn't automatically save the game values from our form to the database. We've connected to the database, but we still have to do all the mapping. We have to grab each value from our form, and we have to specify where each input goes in our database. We got to match up the fields on our form with the fields in our database, and then we have to execute that save. So the first thing we want to do, even before we connect, what I want to do, so inside my PHP tag, but before I connect, what I'm going to do is store the form inputs in variables. This step is optional, but it's a good idea. The reason why is the syntax of using our variables is much easier to type than the syntax of referring to the form inputs directly. The form inputs have underscores, they've got brackets, they have quotes. So it's easy to mistype something and name something incorrectly. So we've got 4 inputs on our form, right? We've got the name, we've got the age limit, we've got the release date, and we've got the size. So I'm going to create 4 variables. Again, I'm going to use the same names. So in PHP, I'm going to create a variable called name. So how do we get the name? So this value is supposed to store whatever the user types here. So how are we going to get that value? Yeah, remember our form is using post. So when we use post, on our next page, all of the values that were posted, PHP automatically collects them into a list or an array. So we can refer to any element in that list or the array. That's why those name properties are important. Asim, you mentioned that earlier when I said, why are we naming the boxes? And you said, so on the next page, we know which value went in which box, right? We've named them descriptively. So here's the syntax. If I use $_, notice what my code editor comes up. These are all of the built-in collections or arrays in PHP. We've got cookies, files, get, post. We'll use most of these. So which one of these do you think we're concerned with? Which array do we want to access? Post, because our form used the post method. So if I choose $_post, now what I want to do is refer to that input by name. And we called it name. So this will give me whatever the user typed in that first text box is now stored in a variable called $name. So we don't have to do this line of code. We could just refer to this value if you want, but this is a heck of a lot easier to type than this. There's a much smaller chance of error. So now I want 3 more variables. And again, I'll match them up exactly. So we called it age_limit on our form and age_limit in our table. So I'll call my variable age_limit equals, and again, I'll use the post array. So we could name the variable something different from our input, but I think that's just going to confuse ourselves. Let's use the exact same name for everything. And then we had, we call it release date, I think. Now this is where being case sensitive is really important. Okay? If I call my form field age_limit, if I type it like this here, PHP won't read that value. It's case sensitive, so it will consider those as 2 separate things. That's why I said either always use camel case or always use all lowercase. And then our last one, we'll create a size variable. So again, this step is optional, but I find it's going to make it easier to store this stuff in variables. So we'll do this every form we build on the save page. This is the very first thing we want to do. Take the values from the form and store them in variables. And it doesn't matter. I mean, we've used text boxes, but if we had used drop downs, check boxes, radio buttons, they're all still part of that post array. The only thing that won't be is if we've uploaded files. If we've uploaded files, take a wild guess which array those files will go in. So we have a files collection if we're doing file uploads. We'll use session later when we come to talking about authentication. Okay? And notice each line we need to terminate with a semicolon, remember. Okay? So now we're connecting to the database. Our disconnect will be the last thing. So we just need to do a couple of other things. So I'm going to save this. The next thing we want to do is set up an SQL command to save the new game. So we're going to set up an SQL command. We're going to populate the SQL with all of our variables, and then we're going to execute it. And once the code executes, that new game should be in the database. And then we can just print a confirmation message if we want. So I'm going to create a variable, and I will use this throughout the course. Whatever kind of SQL command we're running, create, read, update, delete, doesn't matter. I'm just going to create a variable called $SQL. So what kind of SQL command do we need for saving a new record to the table? So we're going to type insert into, what is the name of the table we want to insert into? Games. How do I spell games? Any way I want? Exactly how we created it in MySQL. So I created all lowercase, so it has to be all lowercase here or it will fail. If I type a capital G and try and run the command, I'm going to get a message saying games with a capital G doesn't exist. So what comes next? So we need round brackets. What goes in those brackets? I know you're just learning this in your... Not the values yet. Not the variables. You're close. Not the text box name. The first part of this is we need to specify the column names that are in the database and in what order. So we're inserting into this table and into these columns: name, age limit, release date, and size. Okay. And now we need to supply the variables or the form inputs. So then we specify, so we have a list of fields and we have a list of values. I know you guys are just starting to learn this with Jarrett, so I realize this is new. It will get familiar. So now we need to supply our values. There's two ways we could do this. The quick and dirty and wrong way, or the proper way. The quick and dirty way is simply to put our variables in here. Right? We can do that and that will work. It's not a good idea, however. Why is it not a good idea to just dump our variables directly in here? And you maybe haven't even had a chance to talk with Jarrett about this. One of the things we want to do is we want to make sure that every variable is the right type of data and it's also the right size. If we just stick the variables in that list, we have no way of checking. The other thing we can't check for are special characters, like single quotes inside of a string that will break our SQL. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to set this up. Rather than injecting our values right here, we're going to set up 4 placeholders. And in PHP, we show that by putting in a colon. And these are separated by commas. So we're not actually injecting our variables here. These are parameters or placeholders. This will allow us to check the data type and check the size. The other thing that this will prevent is a nasty thing called SQL injection. What does that mean? What's SQL injection?
So they could write like drop or something in their name and it would run it.
Right. Somebody could load our game details and call the game drop table games. Do we want that to run? No. If you don't think this happens, it happens every day, all the time. I've set up all the websites I've built so whenever errors are happened, it emails me the error messages. And that includes if there are any form values, I can actually see what the users typed in the forms. So years ago when I built part of Walmart's photo center, every morning I would wake up and there would be 24 emails. And I could see all the SQL injection attempts that people, all the SQL commands people were putting in the forms and trying to submit. Things like select star from users, delete star from users, changing passwords, dropping tables, happen every day. So if we just inject the values here, we're leaving ourselves open to that. When we use this structure with the parameters, the PHP library automatically checks for this stuff for us. Okay? So yes, we're writing more code, but we're doing it properly. Okay? We're almost done, about 5 or 6 more lines of code we need. Next, we need to set up a command object. So I'm going to create one more variable. I'll just call it CMD for short. So what we do is we take our connection. This is the funky PHP object-oriented syntax. In Java, you put in object dot. In PHP, we put in the name of an object and then a dash bracket. So what we want is to prepare a command. It basically means take the SQL statement we've set up above, take the connection we've created, and prepare a command object which is going to run our SQL. But we still have to populate these values with our variables. So right now this would run, but we're not inserting any values. We're inserting blanks. We need to inject these 4 variables into the proper placeholders. Okay. So fill the placeholders with the 4 input variables. So here's how we do it. We take our command object, and there's a function here we're going to call 4 separate times. The function is bind param. So take the parameter or placeholder we set up in our SQL and put a value into that place. So we'll call bind param, And here's what we do. So the first thing is we want to fill our name placeholder or parameter. What value are we injecting here?
$sign name.
Yeah, $name that we filled up here. And then we can also give it a type.
So could you please explain that again?
Sure.
How we can stop that SQL injection?
Sure, I'll explain in 1 second. And we said our name was 50 characters. Okay. So this is going to do several things. The first thing is by specifying, because our table only allows 50 characters, by specifying that this parameter is only 50 characters, if someone tries to put in a long SQL string, this will catch it because we're limiting them at 50 characters. The other thing is when we use this PDO bind param, this method has built-in SQL injection checking. We don't have to do it. It's built into that function for us.
I was a little bit unsure, but why did you use that column in front of that name, age limit, and...
That indicates it's a parameter or a placeholder. So it doesn't contain a value. We're just setting up a space for it. And we're giving it the value here. So it's a two-step process. Okay? We set up a place for the value, and then we insert our value into that place. So it's more code. The old way of writing them, they didn't look like this. They used to, our SQL statements, when I first started teaching the class, I'll show you, they looked like this instead. I would just do this. I would just put them right in here. The problem is, if that variable had an SQL statement, it was going to run. So doing it this way instead, by breaking it into a few lines, creating a parameter for each value, and then putting in the type, that eliminates SQL injection. So this is a safer way of doing it. It's more code, but it's more secure. So we need to do the same thing 4 times. Again, we'll bind our age limit parameter with our age limit variable. This one is an integer. Our release date is going to be an integer. I know this syntax is all new. That's okay. We'll use it regularly. It's going to get less strange.
What would you do to put a limit on the integer? So you can't...
You don't, because so let's say you want a number, like we don't want a year greater than 2016. We'd actually typically would do that in our validation. We do it even before it gets here. We'll check it above. We'll do that in a few weeks. Okay. For today, we'll let people enter what they want, but we'll do, lesson 4 is all about input validation. How do we make sure when we give users forms that we don't get bad data from them?
Okay.
So we'll come back to that. So this now populates our parameters with our 4 values. This still doesn't execute the query. So if we ran the page like this, we'd still get no data saved to the database. So we have to do one more thing, and that is execute the insert. So we've set up a command, we've populated it with all our values, and now we just call the execute method.
Didn't we give size a decimal parameter?
Yes, thank you. I think in this case, it's DEC. Yeah, and we said 4,2. So 4 total digits max, 2 to the decimal max. So this should be everything. And I guess the last thing after the execute, we could print a message. We can say echo game saved. Now we can use single or double quotes. We'll look at the difference next week. A lot of the time they're the same, occasionally using singles or doubles with echoes slightly different. So what I want to do now is save my page, upload it to the server, and now I want to try it. I want to fill out my form with a valid game data, hit save, and see if anything goes into my database. Okay. So I just need to, I'll need to put in my password. You can try yours out. And I need to probably look online to find some information about a game. I need to find the size data. I may as well put in real stuff in my database. Before I try, does anybody have any questions about what we're doing here, what's going on?
Just why the sea of red?
You know what? I may have to put that in single quotes, but I don't think so. No. I think because my code editor isn't recognizing. Well.
Worked at mine. Like I'm getting the same thing. I'm just wondering.
I'm not sure. It has to do with the settings. It's just not interpreting that command properly. But I'm pretty sure we wrote it correctly. Okay, so I'm just going to jump so I can put in my password, which is a little bit annoying.